I had always loved camping. Not the kind where you park an RV next to a bunch of other people with lawn chairs and bug zappers. I mean real camping, deep in the woods where it's just you, the trees, and whatever's out there. It was my way of hitting the reset button. No phones, no noise, just silence and solitude. I never thought twice about it until last summer. I picked a spot way out in the national forest, miles from any marked trails. The kind of place you find by studying maps, where you park your truck at the end of a dirt road and hike until you don't hear anything but the wind. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a couple of MREs, water, and my knife. I always carried it, more for comfort than anything. The plan was to stay 2 nights, just enough time to clear my head. The first day was perfect. I found a nice clearing near a stream, set up my tent, and got a small fire going. The woods were quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. I sat by the fire until the stars came out, ate dinner, and crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the woods were completely silent. At first, I thought that's what woke me up, the absence of sound. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know the woods are never really quiet. Crickets, wind, something is always making noise. But this was different. It was dead silent. I laid there for a while, listening. Nothing. No rustling, no insects, not even the creek. That's when I heard it, a single heavy footstep. Not the kind of sound a deer or small animal makes. This was weighty, deliberate. My chest tightened. I sat up slowly, straining to listen. Another step, closer this time. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peered out. The moon was high, casting enough light to see the clearing. Nothing. I scanned the tree line. Still nothing. I felt stupid. Maybe it was a falling branch or my imagination playing tricks. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I had just started to drift off when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the tent. My heart started pounding. I sat up again, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The steps were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the tent, taking their time. I wanted to call out, but my throat was dry. I just sat there, listening. The footsteps stopped right behind the tent. I held my breath, every muscle tense. I could hear it breathing, deep, steady breaths. Not an animal, not a bear. It sounded human. I stayed like that until the sun started to rise. I never heard it leave. No footsteps walking away, no sound of movement, just silence. When it was finally light enough, I crawled out of the tent. The clearing looked exactly as I left it. No tracks, no broken branches. But when I checked behind the tent, my stomach dropped. There were 2 deep impressions in the ground. Footprints, barefoot, human, and they were big. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't care about the fire. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to my truck felt like it took twice as long. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. When I finally got to the truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors. I sat there for a minute, catching my breath. That's when I noticed something. On the hood of my truck, there were 2 muddy handprints. Big ones. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, but not like I used to. I stick to campsites with other people around. Sometimes I tell myself it was just someone messing with me, some backwoods local having a laugh at my expense. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whoever or whatever it was, it wasn't laughing. I always liked camping alone. There's something about being out in the woods with nothing but a tent and a campfire that makes me feel calm. No phones, no traffic, no people. Just me and the forest. I had been doing it for years without any issues. That changed last summer. I decided to camp in the Manistee National Forest in Michigan. It's a huge place, thick with trees and far enough off the beaten path that you rarely see another person. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a couple of MREs, and a knife I always carried just in case. I wasn't worried about animals. Black bears are around, but they usually keep their distance. I got to my spot in the late afternoon. I chose a clearing about a mile off the dirt road, near a small creek. The sun was still high enough for me to set up camp, gather wood, and get a small fire going. I ate early, sat by the fire until the stars came out, and crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. The woods were quiet, just the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Nothing unusual. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. My tent was dark. I laid there for a minute listening. It was dead quiet. No bugs, no wind, just silence. And then I heard it, a low, deep growl. Not loud, but close. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. It didn't sound like a bear. It was too deep, too resonant. It reminded me of a large dog, but much bigger. I reached for my knife. My hands were shaking. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was bright enough to light up the clearing. I scanned the tree line. First, I didn't see anything. Then I caught movement. Something was standing just inside the trees. It was tall, way too tall to be a bear. It was upright, broad shoulders, long arms. It wasn't a person. I could see the shape of its head, dog-like, with pointed ears and a long snout. It was just standing there, watching. My chest tightened. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but I knew better. I had hunted enough to know what animals look like. This wasn't something I had seen before. I ducked back inside the tent, heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I sat there, clutching the knife, waiting. I kept telling myself it would go away, that I was overreacting. But then I heard it breathing, deep, slow breaths. It was close, right outside the tent. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. But then it started circling. I could hear the crunch of leaves under its feet, slow and deliberate. It circled the tent once, then again. I was frozen, every muscle locked up. I kept waiting for it to leave, but it didn't. The third time it circled, it stopped right at the entrance. I don't know how long it stood there. It felt like hours. I could hear it sniffing, low growls rumbling from its chest. My knife felt useless in my hand. If this thing wanted to get in, a piece of steel wasn't going to stop it. Then it let out a sound I will never forget. A howl, but deeper, rougher. It echoed through the woods, vibrating in my chest. And then it just walked away. I heard its footsteps fade into the trees until it was completely silent again. I sat there until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. As soon as it was light enough to see, I packed up and left. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck. Even then, I kept checking the trees, expecting to see it again. I haven't been camping since. I keep telling myself it was a bear, that my mind played tricks on me in the dark. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere out there it's still watching. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks, the kind of trip where you leave your phone in the glove box and live off the grid for a couple of days. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from any marked trails or other campers. It was the kind of isolation I craved, a chance to hit the reset button. I packed light, a small tent, some freeze-dried meals, a couple of water bottles, and my old hunting knife more for comfort than necessity. The drive took most of the day. By the time I parked the truck at the base of the old logging road and hiked in, the sun was low on the horizon. The woods swallowed the light quickly, turning everything to muted shades of gray and green. I found a flat patch of ground near a small creek and set up camp. The tent went up fast, and I gathered enough wood to keep a fire going for the night. Once the flames were crackling, I boiled some water for dinner. The woods had that quiet hum you only notice when you sit still long enough. Leaves rustling high above, the occasional snap of a twig, water bubbling over rocks. It felt calm, the kind of calm you only find when you're completely alone. I sat by the fire until the stars came out, then crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and let the night pull me under. I woke up once to pee, the fire just a faint glow in the pit. The moon was high, bright enough to paint the trees in silver light. I did my business, stretched my legs, and crawled back into the tent. As I drifted off, I thought I heard something distant, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding on wood, but I was half asleep, and it was probably nothing. The next morning was colder than I expected. The fire had burned out completely, leaving a circle of cold ash. I made some coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to hike further up the ridge to get a better view. The woods felt different in the daylight, less intimate, more open. The trail I made was faint, just a line of broken twigs and crushed leaves. I didn't see another soul the entire time. On the way back to camp, I noticed something odd. About 50 yards from my tent, there was a tree with deep gouges running down the bark, as if something with claws had raked it hard. I crouched down to look closer. The marks were fresh, the wood underneath still damp. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, but the spacing between the marks seemed too wide. I stood there for a while, listening, but the woods were silent. Back at camp, I threw more wood on the fire and sat there longer than I needed to. I kept glancing at the trees, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. By the time the sun started to set, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I just never paid attention to the trees before. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods felt heavier, like the darkness was pushing against the tent. I laid there for hours, staring at the nylon ceiling, waiting for morning. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again, that deep, rhythmic thumping. Closer this time. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. It wasn't the kind of sound you hear in the woods. It wasn't an animal. It sounded deliberate. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and slipped out. The fire was just glowing embers again. The woods were still. I stood there for a long time listening. Nothing, just the creak and the wind. I exhaled and laughed at myself under my breath. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. But as I turned to go back to the tent, I saw it, a shape in the trees. Tall, upright, just barely visible between the trunks. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, squinting into the dark, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, neither did I. I backed toward the tent, slow, one step at a time. I didn't take my eyes off it. When I reached the tent, I grabbed my knife. My hands were shaking. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but it didn't move. Finally, I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, some broken tree or a shadow that lined up just right. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't take my time. I didn't eat breakfast. I kept looking over my shoulder as I hiked back to the truck. When I reached the trailhead, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in hours. I never figured out what I saw that night. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone. But I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. Some places make you feel alone in a good way. Others make you feel watched. And once you feel that, it never really goes away. The following months, it stayed with me. Every time I drove past a thick patch of woods or even took the trash out at night, I felt that same pressure in my chest. I tried talking myself out of it. It was nothing, just a trick of the light. But the feeling didn't go away. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I went back, not to camp, just to take a look in the daylight. I parked at the same trailhead and hiked in, heart pounding the entire way. When I reached the old campsite, it was exactly as I left it. The fire pit was still there, the ashes scattered by the wind. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, large, barefoot, deep enough to press into the dirt where the ground was soft. And they didn't belong to me. I turned around and walked out. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. Some questions don't need answers. Sometimes it's enough to walk away and never look back. The story has been expanded with significantly more detail and a clearer, more impactful ending. Let me know if you'd like even more added or adjusted. I've always been a fan of camping. There's something about the calmness of the woods, the steady hum of insects, the way the trees seem to stand like silent guardians that makes me feel disconnected from the rest of the world. But after that trip last summer, I haven't been able to bring myself to go back. I'd picked a spot deep in the national forest, far enough from any established campground that I wouldn't have to deal with the weekend crowd. It was just me and my dog, Tucker, a sturdy black lab with a bark bigger than his bite. The two of us had camped plenty of times before. We knew the routine. Hike in, set up camp, sit by the fire until it burned down to embers, and fall asleep to the crackling of the wood. That trip started no different. We set up camp by mid-afternoon, pitching the tent on a flat spot near a small creek. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm enough for comfort but cool enough to keep the bugs from swarming. Tucker trotted around, sniffing at every bush and tree like he was cataloging the whole forest. I sat on a fallen log, sipping a beer and watching the sunlight filter through the branches. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I built a fire. It was nothing fancy, just enough to cook dinner and give me a little light. I grilled a couple of burgers and shared a few bites with Tucker before settling back in my chair, staring at the flames. The night came on slow and heavy. There was no moon, just stars peeking through the canopy and the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze drifted through. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I zipped us both into the tent, Tucker curled up at my feet like he always did. I remember laying there for a while, just listening. The woods are never completely silent, but that night it felt quieter than usual. I could hear the water trickling in the creek and the wind in the trees, but not much else. No owls, no crickets, nothing. It must have been around 2 a.m. when Tucker woke me up. He let out this low, rumbling growl I'd never heard before. He wasn't a nervous dog. He rarely barked unless someone came to the door, but the way he was growling, it made my stomach drop. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I could feel his body tense against my legs. At first, I thought it might be a bear or a coyote, something passing through. But when I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, there was nothing there. The fire had long since died down to coals, casting a dim orange glow over the campsite. The woods looked the same as they had before I went to sleep, but something felt off. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up. Tucker kept growling. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't loud, more like the sound of someone lightly knocking on wood. I scanned the trees but couldn't see anything. It echoed softly through the dark, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. I tried to tell myself it was just a branch knocking against another tree, but it didn't sound like that. It was too steady, too deliberate. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. The tapping would start, go on for a minute or two, and then stop. Sometimes it seemed closer, sometimes farther. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the woods felt normal again. The birds were singing, the sun was out, and Tucker was back to his usual self. I chalked the whole thing up to nerves. Maybe I'd just been imagining things, or maybe it was some animal making noise in the night. But that second night was worse. It started around the same time. 2 a.m. Tucker woke me up with that same low growl, and as soon as I sat up, I could hear it. The tapping was louder this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I yelled out, thinking maybe someone was messing with me, but there was no response. The tapping just kept going. I started to feel that same cold knot of fear in my stomach. It wasn't the sound itself that scared me. It was the fact that it never changed. The same steady rhythm, the same pauses, the same volume. It was like someone was standing just out of sight, making sure I knew they were there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire with Tucker next to me, gripping my flashlight until my hands were numb. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things and left. I never figured out what it was. Maybe it was just some animal. Maybe it was a person. I don't know. All I know is that I haven't been back to the woods since. And every time I hear a tapping noise, whether it's a branch against my window or the pipes in my house, my heart still skips a beat. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the crackling of a campfire, the way the stars looked when you were miles from civilization. It was my version of peace. That's why, on a weekend when work had me stressed beyond belief, I packed my gear and drove out to a remote campground in the mountains. It wasn't a big site, just a few cleared spaces in the woods with fire rings and picnic tables. No running water, no electricity. Exactly what I needed. When I arrived, There were only 2 other campers set up at sites far down the dirt road. I could barely see their tents through the trees. Perfect. I picked a spot near the back, close to the edge of the woods where the trees were thick and the brush was dense. By the time I had my tent pitched and my fire going, the sun was setting. The woods were quiet except for the occasional crack of branches in the distance and the chirping of crickets. I sat by the fire, cooked a quick dinner, and leaned back in my chair, letting the heat of the flames warm my legs as the night set in. It was around 11 p.m. when I first noticed something strange. I was sitting quietly, just listening to the fire pop, when I heard the sound of footsteps. Not an animal. These were slow, deliberate steps. I turned my head toward the sound, expecting to see another camper walking by, but there was nothing, just trees. I told myself it was nothing, probably a deer or something. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time, leaves crunching softly, as though someone was trying to move quietly but not quietly enough. I stood up, shone my flashlight into the woods, but the light only reflected off the trees. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No answer. Feeling a little on edge, I threw another log on the fire and tried to shake it off. But the feeling stayed with me. Felt like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The sound didn't come back, but the feeling never left. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I left the rain fly open so I could see the stars. The night was clear, but the woods were dark and quiet, too quiet. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I lay there for a minute trying to figure out what woke me. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine, slow, heavy breathing, right outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I froze, listening. The breathing continued, steady and calm, like someone standing just inches from the tent wall. I reached slowly for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The light cast shadows against the tent fabric, but there was nothing. The breathing stopped. I sat up slowly, unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire pit was dark. The woods were still. But then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. A woman maybe in her 50s or 60s, thin, pale. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her shoulders. She was barefoot, wearing a thin nightgown that looked filthy, clinging to her bony frame. She was just standing there, staring. I called out, asking if she needed help. No response. She didn't move. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and stepped out of the tent, keeping my distance. I asked again if she needed help. Nothing. She just kept staring. And then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like she was trying to show every tooth she had. My stomach dropped. I took a step back. That's when she moved. She took a step toward me, slow and deliberate. Then another. Her bare feet made no sound on the forest floor. I backed up to my tent, heart pounding in my chest. She kept walking, head tilted slightly, that smile never fading. I scrambled to grab my keys from inside the tent, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them in the dirt. By the time I picked them up and turned around, she was gone. I shone the flashlight through the trees, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I packed my gear in record time, throwing everything into the back of my car. As I pulled out of the campsite, my headlights scanned the trees one last time. She was standing at the edge of the woods again, watching me leave. I drove until I hit the nearest town and parked in a gas station lot until the sun came up. I never went back to that campground. I never even told anyone about it. I keep trying to convince myself it was some messed up camper or a woman with mental health issues. But the way she moved, the way she smiled, I'll never forget it. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just me and a couple of friends out in the woods, far away from the constant hum of the city. We found a quiet spot near a small lake, deep in the forest where the air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. We set up camp close to the tree line with a clear view of the water. The plan was to fish, hike a bit, and just unwind. It was peaceful at first, until it wasn't. The first night was uneventful. We sat around the fire, the warmth cracking against the cool night air. We shared stories, laughed, and let the hours slip by until we couldn't keep our eyes open anymore. By the time I crawled into my tent, I could barely remember falling asleep. It was the second night when things started feeling off. It was late, maybe around midnight. I was half asleep, lying in my tent with the fire still flickering faintly outside. I heard the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the dirt and leaves. I figured it was one of my friends getting up to use the bathroom, so I didn't think much of it. But then it circled. The footsteps padded around the tents, slow and heavy, stopping every few steps. I held my breath, listening. When I finally peeked through the small mesh window of my tent, I saw something standing near the dying embers of the fire. At first, I thought it was a dog, a big one. Its fur was dark and matted, patchy in some places like it had been in a fight. But there was something wrong about the way it moved. It wasn't sniffing around like a curious animal would. It was just standing there staring at the tents. Its head was low, its body stiff. I couldn't see its eyes from where I was, but I could feel them. It was like it was trying to figure something out. I stayed still for what felt like hours. It finally moved, walking slowly along the edge of our camp. The way it moved made my stomach turn. It wasn't like a normal dog. Its gait was unnatural, too slow, too deliberate. Every now and then it would stop and tilt its head, listening. When it finally disappeared back into the woods, I thought maybe it was just a stray or a coyote with mange. I told myself that anyway. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I mentioned it to my friends. They shrugged it off. Just a dog, they said. Maybe they were right. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The woods felt different, quieter. As we hiked, I kept catching movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing. That night, we made the fire bigger. I think we all felt it, even if we didn't say anything. There was this tension in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a low growling. It was close. My chest tightened as I scrambled quietly to the window of my tent. It was back. The same dog, standing near the edge of the trees. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were two more, smaller, but with the same matted fur and strange, stiff movements. They paced slowly along the edge of our camp, circling like they were hurting something. One of them let out this choked, guttural sound that didn't even seem possible for a dog. I heard one of my friends shift in their tent. The movement must have caught its attention because one of the dogs turned its head sharply towards the sound. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It just stared. I grabbed the flashlight next to me and shone it towards them. The light caught their eyes, reflecting back in an eerie, pale green. They didn't run. They didn't even flinch. They just stood there, staring. I yelled, trying to scare them off. That's when the biggest one took a slow step forward. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I kept the light on it, backing up towards the fire. When I threw another log on the flames, the sudden burst of light and heat finally made them hesitate. They backed up slowly into the woods, but I didn't feel relieved. I felt like they were waiting. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, we packed up and left. As we drove away, I looked back towards the woods. For a split second, I saw something standing between the trees, watching us leave. I don't know what those things were. Maybe they were just dogs. Maybe they were sick or feral. But something about the way they moved, the way they watched us, it didn't feel right. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. I always loved camping. There was something about the solitude, the crackling of a campfire, and the way the trees seemed to breathe around you. That kind of quiet wasn't something you found anywhere else. At least that was what I used to think. Last summer, I drove out to a remote spot in northern Wisconsin. I wasn't new to camping alone. I actually preferred it that way. There was this particular site near a small lake, about 6 miles down a dirt road off the main highway. No cell service, no other campers nearby, just trees and water. Exactly what I was looking for. I set up camp in the late afternoon. The tent went up easy enough, and by the time I gathered enough wood for the fire, the sun was dipping low. It was that kind of warm, golden light that makes everything feel calm. I cooked some dinner, sat by the fire, and let the night settle in around me. The forest came alive with the usual sounds: crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle in the brush. It was around midnight when I first noticed something was off. I was sitting in my camp chair, staring at the embers, half dozing. Then everything went quiet. I don't mean it got quieter. I mean it stopped. No insects, no night birds, nothing. It was the kind of silence that grips you, makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I turned my head toward the tree line. I couldn't see much beyond the firelight, but I could feel something. It's hard to explain unless you've felt it. That sudden weight in the air, like you're being watched. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees. Nothing. A branch cracked somewhere out there. I flicked the light toward the sound, but all I caught were trees. My heart started thudding a little harder, but I told myself it was just a deer. That was the logical thing, right? Deer are everywhere. I threw another log on the fire and tried to shake it off, but that feeling wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop looking at the woods. Then I saw it. 2 eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the firelight. I froze. They weren't the right color for deer. They had this yellowish tint, almost like a predator's eyeshine. I stood up slowly, flashlight in one hand, my hunting knife in the other. I called out, something stupid like, "Hey!" But the eyes didn't move. They blinked once, then rose. They lifted up until they were at least 7 feet off the ground. My breath caught in my chest. I've seen bears stand on their hind legs, but this wasn't a bear. The outline was wrong. Too lean, too upright. I took a step closer, just enough for me to see the shape of it. My stomach dropped. It looked like a dog, but not just a dog. Its shoulders were broad, its limbs long. The way it moved was too fluid, too deliberate. I could see the outline of its head now, ears perked, snout slightly lifted like it was scenting the air. I wanted to believe it was some trick of the light, that my eyes were playing games with me in the dark. But the longer I stared, the more real it became. It let out this low, rumbling growl that vibrated in my chest. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I backed toward my car, slow at first, trying not to turn my back on it. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam jittering over the trees. And then it moved, not toward me, around me. I could hear it circling, staying just out of sight, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. It was fast, too fast. I made it to the car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get it in gear. As I backed out of the campsite, my headlights caught it again, standing in the road. Tall, dark, eyes burning in the light. It didn't chase me. It just watched as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I hit the nearest gas station. I sat there under the fluorescent lights, trying to catch my breath, heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to get my tent or my gear. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far from that place as possible. I spent weeks trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of wolf standing weird. But deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't normal. It was something else. And the worst part? I know it saw me too. I decided to go camping alone in late September, right when the leaves were starting to turn but before the chill of autumn really set in. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest town. It was remote enough to feel peaceful, but not so far out that I couldn't hike back if something went wrong. The campsite itself was a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a small creek trickling nearby, the kind of place where the world felt muted, like the trees absorbed the sound. I set up my tent just before sunset. The air smelled like damp earth and pine sap. As I got a fire going, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky shifted to a deep purple. I cooked some canned beans and hot dogs, ate quickly, and sat back against a log, letting the warmth of the fire soak into my legs. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned down to embers. I decided to call it a night. The first few hours of sleep were peaceful. I woke up once to the sound of something moving through the leaves, but it was probably a raccoon or a deer. I rolled over and went back to sleep. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the sound of movement that woke me. It was the silence. That thick, unnatural kind of silence where you notice the absence of sound more than you ever notice noise. No insects, no wind, nothing. My heart started pounding almost immediately. I unzipped my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, straining to hear something, anything. I felt exposed inside the thin walls of the tent. I didn't want to turn on my flashlight yet. I didn't even want to move. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching softly in the leaves. They came from the edge of the clearing, from the direction of the creek. My throat tightened. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal makes. It was too heavy, too steady. Human. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but it was probably just a minute or two. The footsteps stopped somewhere near my tent. I held my breath, listening. My hands were shaking. I could hear the pounding of my pulse in my ears. After a minute of nothing, I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Nothing. I scanned the edges of the clearing. Still nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm down. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. I switched off the flashlight and lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard it again. Closer this time. Slow, steady footsteps, but now coming from the opposite side of the clearing. My hands clenched the sleeping bag tight. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat up and clicked the flashlight back on, aiming it toward the sound. Again, there was nothing there. But this time, as I swung the beam across the trees, I caught something. The briefest glimpse of movement. Something dark shifting behind a tree. My chest tightened. I called out, but immediately regretted it. My voice sounded small in the darkness. Whoever or whatever it was didn't respond. I got out of the tent, holding the flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. I walked toward the edge of the clearing slowly, my breath fogging in the cold night air. I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. As I got closer to the spot where I had seen the movement, the hair on my arms stood up. There was no one there, but the ground was disturbed. Fresh footprints in the mud. Bare feet, large enough to be an adult's. They led away from the clearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, listening. The woods were still silent. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but it was the middle of the night, and hiking back in the dark wasn't an option. I went back to my tent, zipped it up, and sat with my back to the wall, flashlight in hand, knife resting on my lap. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up my gear. I felt exposed, like I was being watched the entire time. When I finally hoisted my pack and started walking back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder. About half a mile down the path, I found something that made my stomach turn. A piece of cloth tied to a branch. It was from my tent's rainfly, torn and knotted there. I hadn't noticed it missing when I packed up. I didn't stop to think about it. I started walking faster, then jogging. I made it back to my car in record time. I never went back to that spot. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, about the silence, about the footprints. Maybe it was some sick prank. Maybe it was someone living out in the woods. But there's a part of me that doesn't believe that. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were watching me. And I know I was lucky to leave when I did. I decided to head out to the woods for a weekend of camping on my own. I had been out there plenty of times before, but this trip felt different from the start. It was late September, just warm enough during the day but cold enough at night to keep most people away. That's how I liked it. Quiet, calm, nothing but me and the sounds of the forest. I drove up a few miles past the usual campgrounds where families set up with their RVs and grills. I wanted to be away from everyone, so I found a spot about a mile down a dirt trail and set up camp near a small clearing by the trees. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and walking along the nearby trails. The forest felt alive, but not in a bad way. Birds calling, squirrels rustling in the brush, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. By sunset, I was sitting by the fire with a can of chili, watching the last light disappear behind the tree line. When the stars came out, it was pitch dark except for the orange glow of the fire. Sometime around midnight, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I was tired, but my body wouldn't let me sleep. The woods were too quiet now. No owls, no insects, nothing but the occasional pop of the fire. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But then I heard something, not close, but not far either. Footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching through the leaves. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I called out once, more to calm myself than to get an answer. No response. The footsteps stopped, and I stood there for a while, shining the light around until my arm got tired. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer or something and went back to my sleeping bag. I drifted off for maybe an hour before waking up again. This time, it was different. My whole body tensed up the second my eyes opened. The fire had died down to embers, and the cold had settled in. But it wasn't the cold that woke me up. It was that feeling again, the one where you know you're not alone. I laid there for a few seconds, listening. Then I heard it, breathing. Deep, slow, steady breathing coming from somewhere near my tent. My heart started pounding. I reached for my flashlight as quietly as I could, my hands shaking. I clicked it on and pointed it toward the sound. I expected to see an animal, maybe a bear, maybe a coyote, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and silence. I got out of the tent slowly, scanning the area with the light. The breathing had stopped. I circled the campsite, looking for tracks. There was nothing near the tent, but when I moved toward the edge of the clearing, I found them. Footprints, not animal prints, barefoot human footprints. They were deep, heavier than mine, and they circled the camp. My stomach dropped. I tried to convince myself that maybe I made them earlier without noticing, but I knew that wasn't true. I wear boots when I camp. Always. I barely slept the rest of the night. I kept the fire going, sitting with my back to the tent so I could see in all directions. Every little noise put me on edge. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted but relieved. I spent the morning walking the perimeter, trying to make sense of it. That's when I found something worse. Further out, maybe 30 yards from camp, there was a dead rabbit hanging from a branch. His neck was broken and it looked fresh. It wasn't torn up like an animal would do. It was clean, deliberate. I packed up fast. I wasn't going to stay another night. As I was taking down my tent, I heard it again. Those same footsteps, slow and steady, coming from the trees. I didn't stop to look. I threw the tent in the back of my truck, jumped in, and drove out as fast as I could. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. Maybe it was just some messed up person trying to scare me. Maybe it was worse. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. Some places just aren't meant to be camped in. I've always been a big fan of camping. There's something about the quiet isolation of the woods that makes you feel small in the best way possible. I've spent countless weekends out in the backcountry, sometimes with friends, sometimes on my own. But there was one trip a few years back that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was camping in a remote spot deep in the national forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found years before where I liked to set up camp when I wanted to be away from people. I drove in on a Friday afternoon, parked my truck at the trailhead, and hiked about 2 miles to my usual spot. It was a beautiful day, clear skies, a light breeze, perfect camping weather. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the evening relaxing by the fire with a book. As the sun dipped below the trees and the stars came out, I felt that familiar sense of calm that I always get when I'm out there. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, and I drifted off pretty quickly. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. I just remember lying there, wide awake, with my heart pounding. It was completely silent. No crickets, no wind, just silence. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stayed still for a minute, listening. Nothing. I checked my phone for the time, 2:37 a.m. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Sometimes the woods go quiet for no reason. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of the trail. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. I've heard plenty of deer and other wildlife walking through the woods at night. This was different. Sounded heavy. Human. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise. The footsteps kept getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. Whoever it was, they weren't in any hurry. They were just walking. When they got close enough, I could hear something even worse. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. It sounded like whoever it was had been walking for miles. I sat there, frozen, clutching my knife. I wasn't sure what to do. If I made a run for it, they'd hear me. If I stayed put, I had no idea what would happen. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could see the faintest outline of a shadow through the fabric. Whoever it was just stood there, breathing, not saying a word, not moving. I held my breath, hoping they'd just go away. But they didn't. They stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, they started walking again. I listened as the footsteps slowly faded into the distance. I waited another hour before I finally unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and looked outside. Nothing. No sign of anyone. Just the empty woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. On the hike back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt like I was being watched the whole way. When I got back to the trailhead, there was something on my windshield. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My hands were shaking as I opened it. All it said was, "See you next time." I haven't been back to that spot since. I still camp, but I stick to crowded campgrounds now. Maybe it was just some sick prank. Maybe it was something worse. I don't know. All I know is that I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, or the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I always loved camping. There was something about the quiet isolation of the woods that made me feel more grounded, more connected to reality. No phones buzzing, no emails demanding attention, just the crackle of the campfire and the steady rhythm of the forest. I had been doing this for years, mostly solo trips, and I never once felt unsafe. That is, until one weekend last October. I had driven out to a spot about 50 miles from the nearest town, a place I found on a forum where people shared their favorite off-grid camping spots. It was tucked deep in the woods with a small clearing, a stream nearby for water, and not a soul for miles. The drive-in was rough, just a narrow dirt trail that I wouldn't have trusted in the rain. By the time I got there, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the pines. I set up my tent quickly, started a small fire, and settled in with a beer as the stars came out. The first night was uneventful. The air was cold, but the fire kept me warm, and I fell asleep listening to the crackling logs and the occasional rustle of something small in the underbrush. Typical woods noises. I woke up with the sun and spent the day hiking, covering about 10 miles before circling back to camp. My legs were sore, but it was a good kind of sore, the kind that lets you know you earned your rest. That evening, as I was making dinner over the fire, I started to notice how quiet the woods had become. Too quiet. Anyone who spends time outdoors knows that silence is rarely a good sign. I paused, listening. No birds, no insects, not even the distant rustle of leaves. Just the crackle of my fire. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator nearby, maybe the cold. Either way, I brushed it off. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't loud, more like a faint tapping noise. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding in my chest. I listened hard, holding my breath. The tapping continued, steady, rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on wood. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dull orange glow over the clearing. Nothing, just the trees standing silent. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area. My breath hung in the cold night air, and as I turned the beam toward the trees, something caught my eye. About 20 feet away, there were 2 deep scratches in the bark of a pine tree. Fresh. The wood underneath was pale and splintered, as if something strong had raked through it. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. My first thought was a bear, but bears don't tap. I backed toward my tent slowly, trying to convince myself it could have been anything. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with my hatchet in my lap. Nothing else happened. The next day, I debated cutting the trip short. Something felt off, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. I went for another hike, keeping closer to camp this time. As I walked, I started noticing more of those scratches. Not just on one tree, but on several, all roughly at the same height, all fresh. That night, I kept the fire roaring. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I told myself it was paranoia. I even laughed at myself a little, but it was a nervous laugh. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping, louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the treeline. My breath caught in my throat when the light reflected off something. 2 eyes, low to the ground, wide apart, and shining back at me. They blinked once, then vanished. I felt my stomach drop. I grabbed my hatchet and backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the trees. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The tapping started again, faster this time, coming from multiple directions. I made a snap decision. I threw everything I could grab into my bag, stomped out the fire, and bolted for the car. I could hear something moving through the woods behind me, heavy footsteps breaking branches and crunching leaves. I didn't dare look back. I reached my car, threw my gear into the back seat, and jumped in. As I started the engine, my headlights illuminated the trees ahead. For just a second, I saw it. Low to the ground, dark fur, broad shoulders. Not a bear, not a person. I peeled out, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow trail. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. It's been months, and I still think about that night. I still try to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear with mange or something else I could explain. But deep down, I know it wasn't. I haven't been camping since. I've always been a fan of camping. There's something about the quiet of the woods that feels like a reset. The crackle of the campfire, the smell of pine, and the calm that comes with being away from the noise of everyday life. I never really thought twice about heading out on my own for a weekend. That was until last fall when something happened that I still can't explain. It was early October, that perfect time when the leaves are starting to turn, but it's not too cold yet. I packed up my truck with all the basics, tent, sleeping bag, food, the usual gear. I drove out to a spot I had found a few years back, deep in a state forest. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a clearing down a dirt trail about 5 miles off the main road. Nobody ever went out there. That was the appeal. I got there late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip. The light filtered through the trees in that golden way that makes everything look peaceful. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and had a quick dinner. As the night came on, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire for a few hours, just listening to the woods. It was quiet, a little too quiet. At around 11, I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. It didn't take long to fall asleep, but at some point I woke up. You know that feeling when you're not sure what woke you, but you can tell something isn't right? That's what it was. I laid there for a second, holding my breath, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quiet, cautious kind you hear from animals. Heavy, deliberate steps. Slow. Moving around the edge of my campsite. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my phone, but I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to let whoever or whatever was out there know I was awake. The steps circled my tent once, then stopped. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, not labored, just steady breathing. It was close. I stayed as still as I could. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, I gathered the nerve to unzip the tent just a little, barely enough to peek out. There was no one there. I waited another hour before I finally dozed off again. When I woke up the next morning, I went to check around the campsite. The ground was soft from rain a few days before, so I expected to see tracks. But there was nothing. Not a single print. That alone was weird, but I brushed it off. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was an animal. The second night, things got worse. After dinner, I kept the fire going longer. I wasn't as relaxed this time. I kept glancing into the trees. Felt like something was watching me. I even called out once, just to see if I'd get a response. Nothing. Around midnight, I decided to sleep in my truck. I felt safer with the doors locked. At about 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping. It was soft at first, like someone lightly knocking on glass. I sat up, and my heart sank. The tapping was coming from the passenger side window. I could barely see through the fogged-up glass, but there was definitely a shape standing there. It wasn't looking in. It just stood there, tapping. I reached down slowly, grabbed my keys, and started the engine. The second the lights came on, the figure bolted. It wasn't running like a person, though. It was faster, low to the ground. I caught the briefest glimpse of it as it disappeared into the woods. Too big to be a coyote, too fast to be a person. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I threw the truck into reverse and got the hell out of there. The next day, I went back with a friend. We checked the spot where I had parked. This time, there were tracks. They looked canine, but huge. Much bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. I'm talking about the size of my hand, with deep claws dug into the dirt. I haven't been back to that spot since. I still camp, but now I keep to the marked sites where there are other people around. I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a big animal, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that whatever it wasn't afraid of me. And that still keeps me up some nights.